Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here with another tier list, and today we're going to be ranking all the DPS classes in the game in terms of their survivability. Now when I say survivability, what do I mean? I talk about things like passive damage reduction, I talk about their cooldowns, we are taking into account their heals, so the way they have to kind of stay in a fight and sustain the combat, but then also the ways they have to reset the fight, get out of combat, or run away from the action when they're under focus fire. So without further ado, starting in D tier, these would be specs that are pretty bad. And yeah, if you play them, you will probably know that you have a hard time surviving in PvP right now. The first one on the list is Hatred. Hatred Assassin struggles with having a very low base DR. Only good cooldown it has is the damage reduction it gets on its Mass Taunt, which is a 6-second damage reduction on a 45-second CD. That's not bad by itself, but that's kind of all it has. It has deflection, but deflection is countered by yellow attacks. It has Shroud, but Shroud now is only 3 seconds, and white attacks will go through. The healing is not that great compared to Madness, for example. And yes, you can take Overcharge Saber theoretically, but then you would be losing out on a lot of damage. Also, most Hatred Sins are running the 2-time Trouble tactical, meaning that if you want to maximize the damage potential of Hatred, you will not be using the 2 Cloaks tactical, which is really good on Deception, for example. So Hatred overall is just pretty squishy, doesn't have very good cooldowns in the current meta, so it's the lowest spec out of all of them. Next, we have Vengeance. Now, Vengeance has, of course, famously Saber Ward and European Enrage defense, which actually are good cooldowns. They have a lot of very useful effects. Saber Ward, for example, can be useful both against yellow damage and white damage. And what many people don't know is that Juggernaut gets a level 23 passive called Blade Turning, which makes it so for the first 2 seconds of your Saber Ward, you will have 100% defense against melee and range attacks. So Vengeance has useful cooldowns, but unfortunately, the uptime is pretty bad. So we have long cooldowns. I think Saber Ward has a 3-minute cooldown. Enrage Defense, which is your heal to full ability, has 2 minutes without the utility. So long cooldowns, meaning that once they're down, Vengeance is kind of a sitting duck and will just die without really any option to get out of the combat and reset it. Now, Vengeance does have the level 64 talent called War Master, which gives it another 20% additional DR after leap. That's pretty good. But yeah, all in all, the lack of a reset and the long cooldowns just means that Vengeance is pretty bad and can get tunneled quite a lot. So it's in D tier. Moving on to C tier. Now, these are classes which are definitely playable, but in terms of survivability, they have clear weaknesses that can be exploited. First on the list for me is Concealment Operative, which is really struggling since in 7.0 it lost the Revitalizer's passive that used to give a heal on your stim boost and the 20% DR. This is now gone, and only Lethality has access to it. Concealment does have a level 51 talent, which gives it 5% passive damage reduction, so that's pretty good. And then on level 23, you could take Defensive Stance for another 15%, but you can't really take it because you lose too much damage and you would rather take Roll Knife for the DPS. Evasion, yeah, it is not bad, but it only makes you immune to white damage. If you stun, that will also go through. Things like Riposte go through. And you don't have any DR against tech and force attacks like the Sniper has, for example, on countermeasures. Concealment is, however, not D tier because it does have the God roll, which means you are immune for, I think it's 1.5 seconds after you roll. And it does have Vanish, so it can be quite hard to catch. But if you're only running away, then you're not really fighting, are you? So in terms of actually useful defenses, the damage reduction is quite low. And Concealment is C tier. Moving on to the Mercenary classes, Arsenal is first on the list. Arsenal, of course, famously has Energy Shield for damage reduction. It has Chaff Flare, which gives you the decoy buff, which will give you a little absorb and 35% melee range defense. you can take Reflect, and your Kolto can be talented to be actually a hard defensive cooldown. You have access to Rocket Out, which now comes with the Smokescreen utility, meaning that you cannot be leapt to or pulled. So that's really good. Then why is Arsenal only in C tier? Well, it's because you have to pick them now. So previously in the last expansion, all of those used to be baseline, or at least most of them were. But now you have to choose. Do you want Reflect or do you want Rocket Out? Do you want Super Kolto or do you want to be casting while moving? So all of these choices make it so that Arsenal is not as tanky as it used to be. Or if you want to be super tanky, then you lack the mobility and you can still be trained down by melee cleave once your cooldowns eventually run out. IO Merc, as far as I'm aware, has exactly the same defensive skills, active and passively, as Arsenal. So as far as I'm concerned, they're pretty much the same. Moving on to Marksman Sniper. Now, Marksman Sniper has the reputation of being the squishiest class in the game, but I'm not actually sure that's true, because if you look at the abilities that, well, most of the snipers have, you can choose Ballistic Shield, which gives you 20% DR for 25 seconds. That's kind of crazy. You can talent into Over-Prepared at level 64, which is 15% DR for 15 seconds. You have, of course, Countermeasures, which is a 75% Force and Tech DR for 3 seconds. It's not that long, but it's on top of Countermeasures, which also makes you immune to white damage. Then you can take Ballistic Dampeners, and you should, which is a 30% Absorb. So that's after mitigation, so it's a bit worse than 30% DR, but still, I think you can reset them every couple of seconds, making this actually also really powerful defensive. When you're in cover, you have a 20% passive increase to range defense. So this is really good against other snipers, for example, or against mercenaries. You do have Entrench, which is extremely underrated because it means you cannot get pulled by all the PowerTechs running around right now. You cannot be leapt to by Juggernauts, and assassins will hate their life when they cannot use their Shadowcraft against you. So Entrench makes you immune to all these things, makes you immune to stuns as well. And on top of that, it gives you a 60% reduction to AoE damage, which is also really crazy. Then on top of that, Sniper has, of course, its roll, which it can, for some reason, reset 2 times for a total of 3 rolls. If you don't want Ballistic Shield, you can choose to have Face Walk, which doesn't make any sense on Sniper, but for some reason they have that. Sniper also has crazy movement speed, which again doesn't make any sense for Sniper that's supposed to be a turret class, but they have it, meaning that with all these tools, roll and face walk and the crazy movement speed they get after leaving cover when Entrench ends, it can be incredibly hard to pin down a good sniper. Now, the weakness of Sniper, and why I have it still in C tier, is that you kind of need to be good and be proactive with your cooldowns, and not just react to incoming damage. Right? So that's, for example, you need to remember to reset your ballistic dampeners. You need to be pretty quick on making sure that you roll when you have a thermal detonator on you. You need to get the timing right. So if you're good on Sniper, it can be really OP and you can be really hard to kill. But if you're bad, you're just gonna chain feed and die and camp the respawn. Engineering is pretty much the same as Marksman. I have it slightly above it because Engineering has Plasma Probe, which just fucks up all the melees in the game, slows them passively, and you have no cooldown on that, so you can use it to kite. And then Virulence, I have it above Engineering and Marksman because Virulence gets 15% DR for 6 seconds after Shield Probe, which is pretty good, and also Virulence is a bit more mobile compared to the other sniper specs, meaning that your dots will be still doing damage while you move, so you can afford to kite a little bit more and not lose as much damage as the other sniper specs would. Moving on, again in C tier because of weaknesses, I have Lightning Sorcerer. Lightning Sorcerer does have Cloud Mind, which is a 25% DR for 6 seconds every 45 seconds. So that's pretty good skill. In terms of sustain, it got some heals buff last patch, It does have passive 5% DR when static barrier is down, and you have the deionized buff. Well, actually it's debuff, but it gives you 5% more DR in this case. You do get 5% DR on top of that after each Thundering Blast, so that's pretty much 5 to 10% passive DR, which is great. And then on top of that, Lightning, its best defense is kind of that it's very slippery and hard to catch. You have your force speed with a low cooldown. You have Polarity Shift, which gives you 100% movement speed while it's active. And then once you finally catch the Sorcerer, they can talent into Backlash, of course, which is really good against melee and soft stuns them. Once you finally lock them down, then have Force Barrier, which is of course their immunity. And theoretically, you could also take Phase Walk, but I didn't rate that here because for Lightning, the most popular build right now does actually not use Phase Walk. It does use the Elemental Convection Tactical, which means you're going to be running Volt Rush instead. So Lightning is really good, but yeah, it does have some weaknesses in that once you lock it down, it can be quite squishy. It is a sorcerer after all, and the heals are not as good as Madness, for example. But overall, I would say definitely playable and solid spec, if you know how to kite. Next on the list, I have Rage Juggernaut, which has all the same defenses than Vengeance has. But on top of that, it gets a 10% DR from a level 79 passive. It recently got War Master that before used to be Vengeance exclusive, so now that gives it 20% DR for 4 seconds after leap, as well as a stun immunity. You can take Reflect to kind of reset the fire for 5 seconds. So overall, Rage is really solid and actually more tanky now than most people are aware of. But yeah, in terms of Reflect, you're not always taking it. If you want to maximize damage and mobility, you're going to be taking Mad Dash right now. So you don't always have Reflect. And yeah, Reflect itself, I mean, AoE still goes through, so you can die through it. And then again, in terms of other cooldowns, I'm not sure if I mentioned that for Vengeance already, but in general, just the Juggernaut class, I mean, Endure Pain is not really a defensive cooldown, in my opinion at least, because it only delays the inevitable. It doesn't actually reduce the damage you take, just makes you kind of a punching ball and thereby, delays the inevitable end. Next on the list, I have Advanced Prototype. Now, Advanced Prototype sometimes is really OP, especially when it's run in a pre-made with a guard and a pocket heals. AP, of course, has Energy Shield, which is really strong defensive cooldown, and actually its major defense has a really long duration, and the 2-minute cooldown usually will not be 2 minutes, sometimes can be more like 1 minute, because as you get hit, the cooldown gets reduced. The weakness of AP is that Kolto, outside of one-on-ones, is pretty useless defensive. We'll get to Pyro in a second, but yeah, Kolto is not really a def cooldown, in my opinion at least. Power Yield gives you a lot of additional armor, but in the current meta, you have a lot of Madness Sorcerers and Lethality running around, and armor doesn't do anything against their internal damage. So Power Yield, in my opinion, is not that useful. The only really combat reset that AP has is the Super Commando implant, which gives you the old emergency power buff. That's the 1 million damage absorb shield. That is a kind of reset, and that is good, but if you run it, first of all, then your damage output will be lower because it is a tank implant, and also it only lasts for 2 global cooldowns. So yeah, it's way less useful than something like a 2 cloaks on a Deception Assassin or combat stealth on Lethality. The last class in C tier is Pyro. Pyro has everything that AP has, except that instead of resetting the cooldown on Energy Shield, it can reset the cooldown on Kolto. However, Pyro's Kolto is not useless because it comes with a 30% DR baked on top. So that makes it really good. Pyro, of course, also has the shield with a 2-minute cooldown. That's great. So overall, it's just a bit tankier, simply because of the fact that it has 2 useful cooldowns, can also run emergency power. So Pyro, a little bit more tanky than AP. It still has the weakness, however, that when emergency power is down, you can get tunneled. And that's why Pyro, in my opinion, is just a little bit worse than the specs that are still to come. Moving on to B tier. Now, these are specs that, in terms of survivability, are really good, but they're not great, and they're certainly not broken, so you can still counterplay them. First, in B tier, I have Deception Assassin. Deception Assassin is kind of the better version of Hatred because it gets 15% damage reduction after Maul for 15 seconds. So 15 for 15, really easy to remember. And 15% always is, of course, better than 30% for 6 seconds every 45 seconds. That pretty simply is the reason why Deception just feels a lot more tanky than Hatred. The other reason is, of course, the 2 Cloaks tactical, which especially in arenas is really overpowered. Just makes it so your Vanish has 2 charges. And yeah, as long as you have your Stun Breaker, you can always get out of a sticky situation when you're playing Deception. The weakness of Deception is that it doesn't have any really good sustain. Overcharge Saber is not really an option without losing damage. And yes, you do have Shroud, but you don't have the 5-second duration that you used to have. So short Shroud is kind of meh, I guess, and wide damage will still go through. So Deception, while I would say it's definitely one of the better specs in terms of survivability, it's not overpowered or anything. Next on the list, the first of the Marauder specs. Now, Annihilation Marauder might surprise some people, but I will explain why I rate it a little bit lower than Fury or Carnage. First of all, Marauder has really good survivability, even though it got nerfed, rightfully, with the rework of the Default Spliced Genes tactical. But Marauder as a class is still incredibly tanky, right? You have Cloak of Pain for a 20% damage reduction. The great thing about this is that it can last up to 30 seconds if you're continuously taking damage, and only has a 1-minute cooldown, so very high uptime defensive. You also have Saber Ward. You get a stun immunity on Saber Ward if you can take that. You get 2% passive DR with the Brazen Talent on level 73. You can run Undying Rage as a kind of combat reset, and of course you have Camouflage, which just is damage reduce. It is a kind of combat vanish, and it also breaks roots and gives you movement speed. So it's actually a pretty insane ability. Why do I rate Annihilation lower than the other 2 Marauders, even though it does have the heal on Berserk and a couple other abilities? That's because it does not have the, let's say, native stun immunity built into its rotation, as the other 2 classes have. Also, Annihilation cannot take Undying Rage as easily, because it kind of needs the mobility of taking Mad Dash. And Annihilation, therefore, can get bursted if you're not careful with your stun break. Also, the healing of Annihilation is not that good in PvP as it is in PvE, because in PvP you'll always have the trauma debuff that just means that your healing taken is reduced. Most of your abilities have a 4-meter range. So the dot uptime will not be perfect either. And you can get kited a lot as well on Annihilation. So even though Predation is pretty nice, I would say in terms of survivability, I would rather be on Fury or Carnage. Which are the next specs in the list? We're moving on to A tier. These are classes with very good survivability, but I wouldn't call them broken. I already mentioned the nerfs to Marauder in one of the last patches when the Default Spliced Genes got removed. So Marauder used to be even better than that. Arguably extremely overpowered when it could reset its camouflage with Transcendence or Predation. But now they're still strong. Fury, of course, has all of the cooldowns that Annihilation has, plus on top it has stun immunity after Force Crush. So it can have an incredibly long stun immunity combining Force Crush and then Saber Ward afterwards. And Fury also gets 10% extra defense chance after Furious Strike. That's, of course, on top of the 10% that you get from Predation. Why did I rate Carnage above Fury? Carnage also gets the native stun immunity as part of the rotation after Ferocity, so they're pretty equal there. Why did I rate Carnage above Fury? Simply because Fury gets 10% extra defense chance after Furious Strike, whereas Carnage gets 6% defense chance passively and 6% DR from, I think it's the Taru stacking. And yeah, I simply like the 6% DR a little bit more than the 6% defense chance. So that's why I have Carnage slightly above Fury, but yeah, they're pretty similar and both really good, really tanky specs. Last but not least, S tier. Now, S tier are the specs that in terms of survivability are really just overpowered. First on the list, I have Madness Sorcerer. Why is Madness better than Lightning, for example? Well, it's pretty much because of one talent, which gives Madness 15% passive DR when its dots are critting. 15% passive DR is exactly what Deception also has. So Madness has that up all the time. That's incredibly strong. But then on top of that, it has what Deception is lacking, which are overpowered heals. Madness has a really crazy heal when its Static Barrier is on. It does have Force Leech, which is a really good heal as well. Your Force Lightning now heals you passively as you do damage. And on Madness, you actually can run Phase Walk, whereas Lightning will more than often these days not run it. So Madness is kind of just a more tanky version of Lightning. And all in all, doesn't really have a weakness. It has DR, it has heals, it has combat resets. It's just really strong overall. But not as strong as the top dog, also this patch, which is, of course, the Lethality Operative. Lethality is just broken, honestly. I'm not sure what they were thinking there, because not only does it have one of the best damage trees in the game, it is also incredibly tanky. Lethality gets 5% passive DR on level 64 if you take that, which you always do. It gets 20% DR for 20 seconds with Stim Boost, and then baked in, it gets a 5% HP heal every 3 seconds while that's active. So this will heal you for 6 ticks, which means you get 30% of your health pool back with Stim Boost on top of the DR. Next, for some reason, Lethality has the same 15% DR after Shield Probe ends that Virulence has. Not sure why, but I guess it needed more DR. And as if all of that was not crazy enough already in itself, with Tactical Overdrive, you can reset the whole thing and have it ×2. So insane heals, insane DR. Then for some reason, of course, Lethality has Evasion, but it has 1 second extra duration compared to Concealment. So that's a 5-second duration on Evasion, which is great against fight damage. With a talent, you can even increase that to 7 seconds, which is kind of long, kind of insane. Not sure why they needed that. Oh yeah, and you can make it reflect damage back at your opponents. So that's kind of another combat reset. And as a PowerTech main, I really hate it. I have killed myself more times than I would like to admit on the Lethality Operative. So yeah, Evasion is really strong. What else can I say about Lethality? I mean, I guess I didn't really talk about the fact that it also has insane heals. It gets the instant Cold Infusion after roll. It has the 30% extra crit and surge, which affects all of the Colto probes you can put on everyone. And Lethality is actually one of the best healing classes in the game, hands down. Can reach 10k HPS in a normal game, and I'm sure if you would try, you could give Medicine a run for its money. On top of that, Lethality, of course, has the standard roll that the Operative has. It has Holo Traverse, which gives you movement speed. It's a root breaker. It's really good for kiting. And as if all of that wouldn't have been enough and would have already made the spec really strong, it also has Combat Vanish. So all in all, Lethality is just a Swiss Army knife of Star Wars The Old Republic classes right now. Really, in every situation, Lethality has something in its extremely flexible toolkit, and that's why it's the most tanky class in the game right now. That's it for today. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.